Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to explain a few miscellaneous things about 3D modeling. One of them we're going to talk about is the history of the object, which if you notice here under inputs, it retains all that information of how I built this model. Another thing we're going to talk about is naming your object. That's really simple. We're also going to talk about freezing transformations and discuss what proper topology is and anything else I can think of while covering this topic that is pertaining specifically for this topic. Now, let's just dive right into it. By selecting the sword, or whatever object you're modeling, you're going to have all this input information. And in this input here, what happens over time is it actually takes up a lot of memory. And if you don't have let's just say a powerful computer, sometimes if you forget to delete all the history of an object every so often, it will, or it can cause your computer to crash. Having all of this information, if it's a really complicated model and you have other models in the scene and you're gonna work on this monster piece, all this information, if you forget to do this, it will slow your system down and it can cause your computer to crash, or the software anyway to crash. Now, how do we get it to sort of forget all of that? And we're just basically deleting everything we've done to it up to this point. We're pretty happy with our result up to this point. And what we do is we'll do edit, delete all by type, and we'll do history. And that's it. And you'll see under my inputs, there is no history on it. Now, really simple, right? It is simple, but it's extremely important to remember while modeling your object, or objects in this case. You could have modeled a number of different objects. Now, up to this point, now we have our sword. The history is deleted, but now let's go ahead and name it. So in order to name your object, we just go ahead and click here, and under P cube 4, because I had 4 different shapes, it just took on the last the name of the last object that I combined it to. So in this case, P cube 4, and I'm going to rename it sword mesh, and that's it. I'll just call it sword mesh. You can name it whatever you want. And then it looks like I already explained freezing transformations in the previous video, because or maybe not, maybe it happened from combining my objects together. Either way, let's go ahead and cover it again. Modify freeze transformations. What this does is, if I move this object, let's just say over here, and I want it to be translate x 0, and that's exactly where I want it, I'll do modify freeze transformations. It'll clear that information out, and it'll basically sort of put it in its own it kind of clears out its all of its transformation input information here, and that's really important to do. For right now, I want to keep mine here in the center of my scene, but that by doing that, it doesn't mean it sort of relocates display grid. It doesn't sort of relocate the grid to make it 0, 0, 0 over here. It's just the object. So you'll notice, even if I modify freeze transformations, this grid, this is still the true origin point of your scene. It doesn't change the origin point at all. This is, in your virtual world, this is the origin, 0, 0, 0, x, y, z equals 0. It just sort of freezes out the information on that particular object. Now, it's really important to do this also, especially when you're working with other modelers, animators, whoever, because especially animators love this all to be cleared out properly. And we'll get to explaining why that is when we get into animating later in the semester. Like I said, just for now, we'll get into more detail with it. But just for now, grid, there we go. So here is the sword in the grid, and I don't need my grid on. I just wanted to, you know, toggle it on and off one more time for you. And what else I can do to this object? So even though it did start as 4 objects, now it's just one solid object. Then I would like to talk about topology. Topology is the sort of like how the geometric polygons subdivide the subdivisions go around. So all topology can be different on different meshes. For instance, let's say the mesh of the 3D model of a car has very specific sort of style of topology versus a human, or a human face for that matter. And just to get into it a little bit more, let me pull up an image, and I'll even tell you verbatim what the definition is. The study of geometric properties and spatial relations unaffected by the continuous change of shape or size of figures. Now, what does that even mean? It's easier if I just show you. And give me one moment. So, since I mentioned a face, topology of a face, I'm going to go ahead and show you here. Now, you'll notice in this particular image, the left and the right, the left has it highlighted where the edge loops go, and this is the topology of a face. So it has edge loops surrounding the mouth, and in this case, because the mouth is animating, or will be animating, it needs these proper edge loops and proper topology in order to make the mouth sort of smile in this direction, or frown in this direction, or open down this way, or bring the lip up here. Same thing with the eyes. Here would be sort of controlling the forehead coming down or up with like a grimace look or an angry look. And then here we have our eyes, where you can, without the proper topology, it won't blink properly, sort of squint your eyes correctly, and so on and so forth. So this would control the jaw, this light blue one. Now, let me go ahead and show you car topology. And here we are. And you'll notice in this one doesn't have it sort of colorized for you, but I'm going to go ahead and show you the proper topology of a car. Now, on the car, around the wheel well, I can't think of a car that doesn't have this type of topology around the wheel well. Going around the tire in the wheel well section, or in this case it could be the fender, rear fender, you'll notice it always has this topology going around, like so. And you'll see even here, this is sort of where the topology breaks apart at this particular line, and that's sort of the end of the wheel well section, having that proper curvature in that region. Now, if you follow through the rest of the model, you'll notice this is just straight, kind of sort of squared out, if you will, and it doesn't have any sort of major edge loops going around to keep that shape. Also, you'll notice in the rear window of the car here, it has this sort of topology wrapping around here. Again, in these other sections, it's just sort of squared out, going around and down here. So like this, the topology of a cylinder, which we're very familiar with, would look like this, and so on and so forth. I hope that sort of made sense. Now, going back to our model, it is difficult to understand. And if let's zoom out, you'll see actually here what I was talking about right around this region, you'll notice that this is where the edge loop ends on this topology here. And you'll notice the car, it's sort of flat here because it's all squared out. And this is obviously cylindrical, and as well as the tires. And you can sort of see here, right around the edge loop, to make the rounded rear windshield here. And you'll find this all over. This has the same topology as the rear fender. You'll find this all over different cars, these very similar topological style. Same with the face, or even a monster face, or whatever it might be. At low poly, let's see if I can find a better low poly. This one we're looking at is low poly. Maybe if I bring up a higher topology just one more time, just to show you. Here, you can even see he's even labeled some of these. The topology, again, this is a good point that he'd written on here, even. You want to keep the topology actually relatively even, subdivided evenly, and that goes around these points. Now, you're going to notice you'll have certain areas where we would bevel, as we had mentioned. So you'll see where you see these really dark sort of regions here. This is where it's beveled, so it's a hard surface modeling technique that you cannot recreate without having the bevel tool or multi-cut tool, whichever you prefer at that moment, in these particular regions, because otherwise you wouldn't have that hard edge wrapping around. Again, here it's almost as if it pinches around the fender, and with the two lines, the two edge loops, very close to one another. But for the most part, the rest of the topology you want to keep very even, and for a number of different reasons. But one main reason is that you will not get that smooth look that you're looking for if it's not. And the other thing is for our UV sets, and now UVs, we are starting to get into texturing. Now we'll get to texturing sooner than later, but for now we're going to just focus on modeling and to get the correct topology, or as best topology as we can bring up with our current skill sets. Now, if I go back into Maya, we have our sword here, and you'll notice that we do have some similar traits that we've just discussed. In this particular one, we're not animating the object, so we don't have things like the face would, but in reference to the car, we have very similar traits, such as right here, we have our edge loop, and it creases at this edge because we had beveled it, and here's another edge loop, and actually here is a final edge loop because it wraps around. Now again, here another edge loop. Pretty much on a good model, on most good models with correct topology, you should be able to pretty much do this anywhere on your model, where you click and then double click, and it should wrap around your mesh no problem. Sometimes students get this spiraling effect where they'll do this, but it'll wrap around the entire model going down, and that's incorrect topology. That's bad topology. But for the most part, you'll notice it here also where it creases. Okay, and all over this section, and obviously the sword. And then even the sword, if I start here, you'll notice we have this blade. It does run through the entire thing, but we're not so worried about that as we are as of the topology up to this point. So this is really pretty good topology for a sword of this type. Again, depending on the sword, you could have all types of different styles of topology, especially if you have maybe some jagged edges in here or something for some kind of sawing effect or whatever. But for the most part, this is a really solid style of topology here, and it's very clean. If you're familiar with 3D modeling, clean is a term that other 3D modelers may say when they look at your model and they say, oh wow, that's a clean model. They're referencing the topology. Now, for now, that's all I have on topology. We'll get into it more as the semester goes on. But what I also want to do here is I would like to go ahead and discuss one more thing while I've got you here. We've already talked about layers, and as you can see, I still have some of my old objects in here. And at the moment, I don't need these. And I can tell you one thing about these layers. Most of the time, when I have an object selected and I try to remove selected object from a layer, it doesn't work. It rarely works for whatever reason. I don't know if there's a glitch. Maybe it's just on my system. But a lot of times, even in previous versions of Maya, removing selected objects never seems to work for me. So usually I just keep my layer visually here, then I'll delete the layer, and then I'll go ahead and create a new layer. It's an extra step or two, but it does happen, so just be wary. And I don't need these anymore, so I'm going to delete layer, and I'm just going to delete both of these because I don't want them anymore. And I don't need this one either. I'm going to delete that layer. And if I wanted to keep this on a layer, this is really, really helpful tip going into our environment that we're modeling, the interior of a room. We're going to go ahead and you can keep each object on a separate layer, so you only have to focus on one item at a time. Oop. And I'm going to go ahead and, if I just create a layer, create empty layer, and I name it, and let's just call this one sword layer. I like to keep my personal naming convention with whatever it is, and the reason for that, save. I don't have the sword on it yet, but the reason I name things like sword mesh or sword layer is because if I'm going through something such as like the outliner, which I'm going to get to in a second, it's much easier to find my object, especially if I have an entire scene and I have tons of objects and layers and whatever, and if I have each one called layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and P cylinder 1, P cylinder 2, P cylinder 3, it's going to be really difficult for me to find my objects in my scene. So what I do is I set layers, and I'm going to highlight this object, right click here, and do add selected object. Now that object is here. Another thing we can do, this P, I don't exactly know what it does. Not gonna lie, that started in, I believe, last year's version of Maya, and I'd never had it before. They didn't have this little P, so for me, it hasn't make or break anything, because I honestly still don't know what it does. But here, this stands for transparent, and it's unselectable. On my third little checkbox here, this stands for R, which is renderable, meaning it's visually seen in a renderable camera. However, I still can't select it because it's sort of like locked at that point. And then just the blank, meaning it's editable. I'm able to make edits to it, select it, move it, rotate, transform, scale, etc., etc. And then here we have V for visibility. So no visibility, yes visibility. So that covers the layers here. And now one last thing I'm going to cover is our outliner. Here we go. Windows outliner. And here your outliner should pop open. And I never named my image planes. And then you'll notice I have sword mesh. So it doesn't show my layers, but some of our other windows that you can open will this is the only one we need to worry about right now. So we have our, it has everything in the scene here except layers. So as far as cameras, objects, if we had any particle effects, image planes, you name it, it will be in here. So default light set, default object set, and then we have our image plane 1, image plane 2. Now, if I were to take this one step further, I would rename this one to front image plane, and this one I know will be side image plane. And those are sort of just some really good practices to get into. Freezing transformations, delete all by type history. If you were to have an animated object, you wouldn't want to delete all by type by history. You would modify delete, where are you? Or edit delete by type history or non-deformer history. And you can see this is getting a little too detailed for where we are at in the course, but the only two you need to worry about right now is delete by type, which will only affect the object you have selected. Delete all by type will affect every object you have in the scene. So you got to be careful about that. And later on, we'll talk more about non-deformer history, but for the meantime, we're only going to focus on delete by type or delete all by type and history. Okay, and I believe that's everything I want to cover. These are the basics to creating a model in a work environment that other people will be working in your scene with, and keeping a proper naming convention, keeping a clean file. So not only is your object's topology clean, your file is also clean. And how you do that is exactly everything I just showed you. Delete all by type by history. Make sure your objects are named. Freezing transformations. And obviously we want to keep our topology as clean as possible. So that's it on this particular lab. I want you to go ahead and submit your file with your object named, the history is deleted, you froze transformations, and that's about it. So I hope you enjoyed this. These are what we needed to cover in this particular lab. I hope you enjoyed it, and try and keep this in the back of your head on every model you create, because it as you create the objects, it's much easier to name them and do all of these steps now versus later when you have, let's just say you have 25 objects in your scene and you didn't name any of them, and etc., etc. It's much more difficult to go through this outliner here to locate your objects, especially if you want to make some edits or whatever you want to it. And it helps also, not absolutely necessary. In this particular lab, yes, I do want you to add your sword to a layer, make sure it's on its own layer, and I can hide or show it. The object itself, the input should, the only thing you should have here is the name of it. Just make sure, let me see, it should keep the name, yep. And then after that, make sure your image planes are named if you still have them in the scene, which you should, and that's about it. So submit your file just as you see here, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the next one. Thanks for watching.